Welcome to this CreatorConf 2017 video. A big thank you to all the speakers that took time to give these talks. Hopefully you enjoy this video series. And also be on the lookout. You can go to creator.io to get all the latest JavaScript news. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Josh Owens. And we've got some other exciting stuff coming up in 2017. Thanks. Enjoy the video. Today we have Wes Boss with us. Welcome, Wes.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I feel like I should introduce you, but probably everybody knows you, right? Because you're a pretty famous trainer now.
Sorry, dropping shit. Yeah.
But if you're unaware, Wes has several paid and free courses. I would highly recommend checking them out. His most recent one is JavaScript 30. It's pretty awesome. I'll let you take it away from here, Wes.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm really excited to be here. I've never given this one online before, so hopefully it goes well. So my name is Wes Boss. I'm from Canada, and I'll tweet out a link to the slides, or I'll post them in the chat if you're looking for them. I'm a creator of a series called ES6 for Everyone, which is just a 66 video course that just gets down into the nitty-gritty, into every single part of ES6 and all the little different bits and pieces. So if you want to check that out, it's at ES6 for Everyone, or ES6.io is the domain name. I also have a course on React. I've got a book on Sublime. I've got some free courses on Command Line, Flexbox. I got all kinds of stuff if you're interested in checking it out. But today I'm here to talk to you about ES6. And ES6 is sort of the next version of JavaScript, the most recent update to JavaScript. And it was just a massive update. It included all kinds of stuff. It was many years in the making. And I'm just going to go through some of the pieces that I think are helpful. Obviously, I can't go into it all. But I'm just going to sort of rattle through a whole bunch of stuff. And along the way, you'll probably be like, I knew that already. But hopefully you pick up like 1 or 2 or 7 little tidbits that you can start putting into work right away. So start with things that are life makers, things that make life so much better. And that is the 2 new types of variables, which is let and const. So some people say you should never use var again. It's a bit of an opinion there. It doesn't really matter all that much. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to explain exactly what's going on with those different things. Flashing thing. Ooh, chat.
Oh, I think we lost your audio, Wes.
Can you still hear me?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah? Okay, cool. Sorry, I just popped open the chat. People are saying stuff. Yeah, if you want to heckle me in the chat, please go for it. So
we'll also collect questions in the Q&A part of the app as well, and we'll do those at the end. So
awesome. So there's 2 new ways that you can declare variables in JavaScript. That's let and const. Both of them are something called block scoped. So let's take a look at an example of the traditional scoping in JavaScript, which is function scoping. So if I create a dog variable right here, and then I have a function that has another dog variable, and I run that function, dog is going to be equal to Snickers, because this var dog is scoped to this function here, and this globally scoped dog is what's going to be console logged or alerted when we run it. Now, in let and const, block scope is whenever you have a set of curly brackets. That's what a block is in JavaScript. So if I've got an if statement here, and I create a sentence variable here that just makes a string, and then I try to console log it inside, it will work. But if I try console log it outside, it's going to be it's not going to be a variable. And the reason is because when you declare a variable inside of a block, a set of curly brackets, then you can go ahead and it will be scoped to that block, even though it's not a function here. That's helpful. So that is really helpful. In general, people say use const unless you need to reassign the variable. We'll talk about that in just a second. But there is a very handy use of let, where if you've traditionally been using a var in this case. So here's an example of your traditional for loop, where we're looping from 1 to 9 and console logging I am 1 years old, 2 years old, 3 years old, et cetera, right? So we understand what's going on here. Now, what is that going to give us if we were to run that in the console? Well, it's going to say I am 1 year old, 2 years old, et cetera, just as we expected. However, once we're done, we have this age variable that's set to 10. So first, we have this like global age variable that sort of leaked outside of this for loop, because this is a for loop, not a function, meaning that this age variable is going to leak outside. And then also it's 10 because it reaches 10 and it actually doesn't meet the condition in your for loop. So that's okay. It's kind of weird that we have that like age variable that just like leaked out, and that might bite us in the butt sometime later. But what happens if you were to try access that age variable after some amount of time? So the classic example here is if you like fire off a couple of AJAX requests, and then after they come back, you need to access that variable in which it was fired off with. So in here, I'm just setting a timeout, and after 200 milliseconds, what's going to happen? Well, we've got I am 10 years old 9 times. So what's happening is that this for loop is running 9 times over, but by the time that we get to the console log, this for loop is over, and the age variable keeps getting overwritten every single time. And it's not really something that's a bit of a pain for us since we can't access it. And previously, what you'd have to do is you'd have to do like an ify where you pass the variable in and you make like a little closure so that it's there for you. However, what we can do here is just change our var when we use a for loop to let. And because let is block scoped, see this little curly brackets, it's going to scope the age variable to each of the loop iterations here. So no matter when we actually call that age variable, it's going to be equal to whatever it was when that block was run. It's not going to constantly overwrite that global age variable. And then as an added benefit, you don't have that age variable that leaks outside of your loop. So that's what we get 1 through 9. We don't have a 10 anywhere. We don't have a global age variable. So const is exactly like let. It's block scoped like we just looked at. However, the one difference with const is that const variables cannot be changed, kinda. That's the idea, is that it's a constant. So they can't be changed on purpose. So if you were to create a const and set it to something and try to update it, it would throw an error. Or it cannot be done accidentally, and this is actually true for both let and const. If you try to redeclare that variable in the same scope twice, it's going to throw you an error because it has already been declared. So it's still block scoped, but people think, maybe they're coming from different languages, maybe they assume since it says constant means it will never change, but that does not mean that it is immutable. So let's take a look, and this is especially the case when you're dealing with objects and arrays. So here I've got a baby Wes. I was born, and when I was born, my parents created an object, and they put an age on it. I was 0 when I was born. I don't know about you. And I was 7-something pounds probably, and my hair color was brown. Now, over time, properties about me change. So my age changed, my hair color changed, my weight changed. All of the properties about me had changed. But by using const, make sure that we cannot wipe myself out. Because I'm still the same person I was when I was born. I'm still that same object, but the properties on me cannot be changed. So we can't accidentally overwrite Wes. We can't accidentally wipe it out with a blank object. We can't accidentally wipe it out when a new Wes is born. So by using const, make sure that we cannot wipe out the reference to that array or object, but properties inside of it can change. There's something called object.freeze. If you actually need to freeze all the properties in your object or your array, make sure that nothing in there changes. That's object.freeze. That's what you want in that case. So let's talk about something called template strings or template literals. And I love these because everybody sucks at concatenation. So we have single quotes, we've got double quotes, and now in JavaScript we have what are called backticks, which are our third way to declare strings. However, they're sort of like superstrings in that we can do a little bit more with them than our traditional stuff. So the old way that we used to concatenate variables into a string was you would have to do something like this. My name is, you end the quote, you concatenate in the variable, you concatenate in the new string, you open the quote, and often you screw that up because you forget one of the quotes or one of the pluses, and then you do this huge long template string or this long string, and it tells you the errors like on line 1. And clearly it's on that, but somewhere in that you actually goofed it up. So with ES6, you can now just interpolate your variables right inside of the value. And if you've done any other language before, you're like, okay, we had this like 40 years ago in my language. JavaScript hasn't had it. So we now have the ability to use $ curly brackets, and that's the syntax to say, I am interpolating this actual JavaScript. In this case, we're popping a variable right inside of our sentence right here. But you can also do a whole bunch of other stuff rather than just popping in a variable. I know in PHP, if you use double quotes, you can just pop a variable in. But with JavaScript, you can run any JavaScript inside of those curly brackets. So you can go ahead and do some multiplication if you want. You can run a function that will return to you a number or a string, and it will interpolate the returned value into your string. It's super handy for when you're creating HTML, and I've been using this quite a bit lately. So let's say I've got this object, which is a person, and we've got a name, a job, a city, a bio, all in that person, right? We've all got this object before back from an API. Well, one nice thing about template literals is that they are multi-line without having to do that annoying / at the end of every single line. So here, I've just opened it up, and then I've written all of my HTML inside of that div with a class of person. I've templated out and I pop in my person name, my job, my city, my bio, and then we pop that into your document. Now, as with anything, if you are creating HTML from data that comes from an external source, make sure you sanitize that first, because if this was coming from an API or someone's bio where they had an image with a script tag, then obviously that would be bad. But here I'm popping it right away in. So what's cool about this is that JavaScript is a templating language now. So let's take a look at some of the different parts of a templating language that you might have. Looping is the first one. So I've got an array of dogs here, where each dog in the array is an object, where each dog has a name and an age. And then I've taken the dogs array and I've mapped over that. And what does map do? Map takes in an array of something and returns you a new array of something else. So in this case, I'm taking in an array of objects. I'm mapping over it. It's giving me dog. And then we are returning a list item with the dog.name, dog.age times 7. And then finally at the end, because that's still going to return you an array. And if you try to put it in an array into HTML, you'll get those little commas in between each item. So if you join it on the end, that will put it in. So that's what we get at the end of the day, where we've generated all of our HTML by mapping over each one. Now, how do you do if statements? And by the way, if these look familiar, it's because this is exactly how we do templating in React as well, because we don't have any sort of logic in React in JSX. We just have JavaScript at our disposal. So let's say we've got this song object here where we've got a name, an artist, and then sometimes, just sometimes, you get a featuring property on that object. And if there is a featuring property on that object, you want to put in featuring Biggie Smalls. So what we do here is you give yourself a backtick, you put in your regular paragraph tag with the name and the artist, and then we'll do a little shorthand if ternary operator song.featuring. If that is true, then we do featuring song.featuring. Otherwise, we return null, and that will not put null into your HTML. That will just give you nothing. Everyone's talking about my code editor font. It's operator mono, everybody asks. Now, what's cool about this is that you can use render functions just like we do in React. So here I've got a beer object where it's got a name, it's got a brewery, and then I've got a bunch of keywords inside of that. And it's fine to put the beer name and the beer brewery inside of that. Now, what I want to do is I don't really want to do the map right inside of here, because that's getting a little bit hairy for me. So what I'll do is I'll shell off the looping of those keywords to a separate render function. So I'm just running a function called render keywords. We'll look at that in a second. You pass it your array. Remember, this was an array of keywords here. And then we'll go on the next slide. Here's our function called render keywords, which will in turn loop over each of the keywords and return a list item for each of those. So I've just shelled it off to a separate function. Another cool thing about ES6 is something called default function arguments. So we've got a function here called calculate bill. And every time I do this talk, I think about this like short, stubby, chubby little Western man called Calculate Bill. And he goes around with two guns and goes, "Pow, pow, pow. I'm Calculate Bill." So I hope you're laughing because I think that's hilarious. You pass in the price, obviously, and then you want to calculate the tax and the tip. And in Ontario, where I live, the default tax rate is 13%, and the general accepted tip is 15%. So those are like defaults that I want to set in. And if they are not passed in, I want to fall back to those values. So when you define the when you define the arguments or the parameters that are going to be placed in, you can also set what they will fall back to if they are not passed in. So here I can go ahead and just pass in the defaults. I can pass and override it with my own defaults, 5% tax rate, 20% tip rate. Or, and this is a little bit weird, but if you want to leave just one of them out, then you have to explicitly pass in undefined as the actual value. You can't just pass in nothing. You cannot pass in null. You can't pass in false. You can't pass in an empty string. All of those falsy values that you are used to having passed in is not what you want, because an empty string is still an argument. So you need to explicitly pass in undefined. All right, let's heat it up a little bit. Let's talk about something called arrow functions. So we've got here an array of names, and this is just ES5. So I'm just going to make sure that we understand exactly what's going on, and then we're going to kind of refactor it together. So we've got an array of names, and for each of those names, I want to put boss on the end. So I want to say West boss, Cape boss, and Lux boss. So I take the names, I map over it, I give it a function which gives me the single name, and from that I return that name, West, Kate, or Lux, plus the word boss. Okay, everyone get it? This is what we're doing here. Now, how do you convert to an arrow function? Well, first, you take the word function and you replace it with an arrow on the right-hand side. So delete the word function, put an equals and an angle bracket, and that will turn it into an arrow function. So that's the first thing that we're doing, and that's just the concise syntax. Then, if you have a single argument, you can lose the parentheses around it. So here I've got the name is the only argument that we have, so you can remove it. Some people prefer to leave it on just because it looks a little bit better to them, or like if you add a second parameter in the future, you don't have to add them in as well. That's just personal preference. You choose whatever works for you. But in this case, I'm removing the parentheses because single arguments are not needed. And often you'll see like a hotshot coder do something like that, and it won't look like a function because it's just a bunch of text and an arrow, but that's exactly what that is. It has something called implicit return. So hold on, what's explicit return? Explicit return is when you type the word return, and then you return whatever it is that you want to return for the function. Now, implicit return is when you are returning without having the keyword return. So if you lose the curly brackets, the block of the function, and you can lose the return function, that is implicitly returning. And all too often, you're coding these short little functions where you're simply just taking something in and returning something immediately, especially with map, filter, reduce, all these array methods where they're just one-liners. Well, from that, what we can do is delete the block of the function and delete the word return, and whatever you write after the arrow function will be implicitly returned, which means it will be returned. And sort, yeah. Ryan Burgett, just lighten up that chat room. Good job, bud. What if you have multiple arguments? Well, multiple arguments, like let's say you need the index for that map. Well, then you have to put parentheses around it and pass it just like that. If you have no arguments, like if you have a set timeout where you're not passing any arguments there, you just give yourself an empty set of parentheses, or you can really put anything that you want there. There was a while where people were just putting an underscore, so like it's like giving up the character to undefined just so that they don't put it there. But I much prefer to put an empty set of parentheses there because it looks like a function. Maz, I didn't know that implicit return is so cool. Right on, bud. So what if you want to implicit return an object? Well, the curly brackets means that it's a function block. So how do you return curly brackets if it's an object literal? Well, if that is the case where you actually want to implicitly return an object, you have to put some parentheses around the thing, and then that will kick in your order of operations for you, and it will return the object for you. Now, all of that stuff was just syntactic sugar, meaning that it didn't really add any new functionality. It was just allowing us to write our functions in a bit of a shorter format. However, there also is a major difference with arrow functions is how it handles the keyword this. So with arrow functions, the value of this does not change. So you know that every time you enter into a new function, the value of this will be bound to whatever it's being called against, or if it's nothing, it will be the window. So with an arrow function, the value of this doesn't change. It doesn't change in the function, and it will inherit it from whatever the parent scope is. So let's take a look at some example here. Again, this is not ES6, but let's just understand what's going on here. I've got like a card. I selected a card with query selector, and then I'm going to wait for somebody to click that. And when they click it, I want to add a class of closing, which is immediately. And then a second later, which is why I'm using set timeout, I want to add a class of closed. So we open the function. Here's a regular function here. We say this, and what this is going to be equal to the card, the class list to add closing. And then we run a set timeout with a new function. So when I have that, this is entering, we're entering into a new function with set timeout, and this is now going to be equal to whatever it was called against. And in our case, it's window.setTimeout. So this is going to be equal to the window. So how do you access the card from inside of the set timeout? Well, you can't unless you do some of these tricks that we used to do, where you say self equals this, or underscore that equals this, or underscore this equals this. You just sort of store it in a variable, and then in the scope that you need it, you then reference it. So you sort of have to cache it in a variable for yourself. But that's not great because you have to create a new variable. Now, what we can do in our case is simply just take that function, change it to an arrow function, and now we're off to the races and it will just work. Why? Because when you have an arrow function, the value of this does not change and it gets inherited from the parent. So it's sort of like if you're familiar with CSS and you know how if you position absolute something and you put like a top, a right, a bottom, or a left value on it, it will then look for the nearest relative parent to get its values from. Works exactly the same way, where it will sort of just keep going up the chain until it finds a parent function or a regular function to base its this value off of. Enhance object literals. So there's a couple new things when you're creating an object literals. If you have the same name properties, so how many times have you done this? You got a whole bunch of variables to deal with, and you need to put them in an object. So you do something like first, last, age, breed, right? You write the same thing over and over. However, with ES6, if the property name and the variable that you are putting into the object are the same thing, like the property is going to be first and the variable is first, you simply just type the variable and it will inherit or assume the name from the actual variable there. And then if you have other things where the property name is not the same, you can just use it as a regular object. Let's talk about method definition. So you have an object with a whole bunch of methods on it, and if you want to rename those, you just simply delete the word function, take out the colon, and that is still a proper function. I see a lot of people changing their methods over to arrow functions because it's shorter, but that's not what you want to do in a lot of cases because you need it to be bound to that instance. So what we're doing here is this is still a proper function. This is not anything changing with this, but it's just a shorter way to actually write it without having to type out the word function. Tooling, I'm just watching the chat here, and it seems like a lot of you know about Babel already, so I'll go over this fairly quickly. But if you want to write ES6 Today, you can write almost all of it and transpile it down into whatever it is that your browser is compatible with. So we use Babel or BABEL. It's Babel. It's supposed to be BABEL, but So you take in your syntax, it will convert it to whatever it is, the equivalent in your ES5. You can also decide which pieces get compiled down, because a lot of the browsers now, or all of the latest browsers, support all of ES6. So in some cases, if you're supporting just the latest browsers, you don't necessarily need to compile it all down. If it's new features, so things like promises, sets, and maps, these aren't syntax changes. These are actual features in the browser. So you need to use a polyfill in that case. So there's a BABEL polyfill out there. There's another one called polyfill.io, which will feature detect your browser and just inject the ones that you need. That one's really nice as well. You sort of just have to go along with whatever it is that you need to support. There's a couple things in ES6 that are unpolyfillable and untranspilable. So proxies, symbols, parts of subclasses. Some of this more like deep-endy stuff, where if you're using it, you probably already know that this isn't supported yet. But we'll have to wait until you drop older browsers that do not support those things. But for almost everything I'm talking about today, you can transpile it down into your regular code. Now, let's talk about deep end and destructuring. Destructuring is one of my favorite parts of ES6. It covers, I think I have 6 videos on it. It just covers all kinds of stuff. It covers a whole bunch of different parts of working with objects and arrays. So let's look at it. So put simply, destructuring allows us to create and assign multiple variables in a single line of code. It works with objects and arrays. So here we go. We've got a person variable, which has a first, a last, a country, a city, and a Twitter. And chances are, if you're ever templating with an object, especially if it's a deeply nested object, you just like to put them into their own variables so that your template doesn't sort of get out of hand. So you may have done this before. So first equals person.first. Twitter equals person.twitter. City equals person.city. And then your console log all those variables, right? You just make a whole bunch of variables and then use them. Well, with destructuring, you can use the curly bracket syntax. This is not an object. This is destructuring curly bracket syntax, where you say const first, Twitter, and city. So we're making 3 variables here equals person. And what that's going to do is it's going to check if there's a person.first and put it into the first variable. Check if there's a person.twitter, put it into a Twitter variable. Check if there's a person.city, put it into the city variable. So we just made 3 variables in one line of code. Now, this is especially helpful when you get data back from an API where it's super nested, super deeply nested. So what we could do is you can just destructure west.links.social, and you can pull out Twitter and Facebook out of that nested one into its own variables, so that your templates don't look like west.links.social.twitter, or even worse, often it's like data.results 0.beard.name.first, and it's just nested in infinitely. You can also rename them. So chances are you might run into a situation where if you're trying to destructure it into a variable called Twitter, that might not work because you already have a variable called Twitter, and it's not your fault that the property is called Twitter. So in this case, we can take the property called Twitter, put it into a variable called tweet. Take the property called Facebook, put it into a variable called FB. You can also fall back to values. So here I have a Wes and a boss, first and last, but there's no middle. So if I were to try destructure something that does not exist, it will be undefined. But in this case, I'm setting a fallback value to killer. And in that case, it's going to say Wes killer boss when I console log all 3 of those values, because it will fall back. Now you can get really nuts with this and actually both rename and do fallback values. So I'm going to destructure the middle property into a variable called middle name. And if the middle property does not exist on person, fall back to a string of Twitter. And you can also do this with nested objects where you can destructure nested values as well. So that was with objects. You can also do this with working with arrays. So here I've got details equals, and this is common if you're working with like a CSV, you're getting data from someone in corporate, has a spreadsheet, and they give it to you. and you need to destructure those into their own variables. Well, the first thing is the name, the second thing is the ID, and the third thing is their website. So you just destructure the first thing, the second thing, and the third thing. So if you destructure an array, it is based on index, whereas destructuring an object is based on property. You can also swap values with destructuring. So have you ever had like two variables and you just need to switch the values with them? So here you have somebody who's current and someone who's benched. Maybe, I don't know anything about sports, but maybe someone's playing a sport where there's a bench and then there's someone that's playing the sport. And you want to switch them. Now, so what you'd have to do is you'd have to make a third variable that's like a holder variable. You set the holder to current, the bench to current, the current to holder, and you're like, what? What is going on here? So what you can do now is you can swap the values by destructuring, and you make an array with the values in the opposite order that you want. So current is going to be bench, and bench is going to be current, and they will switch those two for you. Return multiple values from a function. Here we have a convert currency function, which will take in an amount, so say $100, and it's going to convert that to US, GBP, AUD, and MEX, and it's going to return to you an object of converted currencies. Previously, what we'd have to do is we'd convert it, we'd pass in 100 and convert it to a rates object, and then we'd access the properties on each of those. So rates.usd. However, now with destructuring, you can just destructure them into their own variables as you want. So because convert currency returns an object, you can destructure into USD, GBP, AUD, and MEX, and then they will have their own variables. Now, what's really cool about that is that you can just pick and choose the pieces that you want. So here I'm converting currency, and then I'm just picking the AUD and USD properties off of that object into their own variables, and the other ones get garbage collected. Now, next up, we have something called sets. Sets in JavaScript are sort of like the arrays that you've always wanted. So a set in ES6 is like a unique array, so it is absolute unique values with a nice API for adding, removing, and checking items. So think back to when you were first learning JavaScript and somebody told you about pop, shift, unshift, slice, splice, and all of these different array methods. And you're like, how will I ever remember that? And some of them are inclusive and exclusive, and it's a little bit confusing to work with arrays. Well, the set API is just beautiful to work with. So here I've got a set, and I'm going to add Wes, Snickers, and Kate. Or what you can do is you can create a new set and pass it an iterable. So anything you can iterate over. In this case, I'm passing it an array, and that will turn it into a set. Cool thing about that is if I try to add the same item again, so in this case, I'm trying to add a string of Wes, it will make it unique, and it will just it will not take that extra Wes. So it'll say, well, that's already in here, so why would I add that again? And actually, that's kind of a nice little way is if you ever wanted to filter an array for just unique values, you could just pass it into a set and then put it back into an array. I'm not sure, there's probably better performant ways to do it, but if you turn an array into a set, it will just dedupe any duplicates that you have in that values. Now, you can delete things by passing it the value that you want to delete. You can check the size by saying .size. You can empty the entire set with .clear. You can check if an item is in there by saying .has. There's no index of or includes. It's just .has, and that will return true or false. You can loop over it with the new ES6 for of, so not for in, but for of. So const student of students, and you can also log the student in there. You can put anything into a set. So I was just using strings there, but in this case, I've put a object into my set. I've checked if it's in there, and I've deleted it. Now, a couple of people ask me every time I do this talk, does that mean it does a deep check on the object? That's not the case. If I had two objects that were separate objects but had the same first and ID values on them, those are still two separate values because there are two different objects. So it doesn't do a deep check of the values in the object. It just does reference to the actual object inside of it. Woo! So that was a lot. ES6 is just jam-packed with all kinds of stuff. But I've just scratched the surface in terms of what we could possibly be doing with all of this stuff. But you better hurry up because ES7 is coming, or ES 2016 is coming. I'm actually just kidding. It's only 2 things. So ES6 is just a massive update to JavaScript. And then I think they're like, that was probably a bit too much. Let's go on vacation. So ES7 or ES 2016 is going to have array.includes, where you don't have to do that funny .indexOf thing. And then you can also use the exponential operator, which is 2 asterisks, to get 2 to the power of 3. There's lots of time to learn ES6. I think that it's really cool because you can just like learn little things like, oh, I use destructuring here and an arrow function here, and I'm starting to use the new variables and block scoping and all of these things here and there, and you can just start like sort of tearing off little pieces of ES6 and start using them in your code today. But time to get at it. It's a better time. We're starting to see all of tutorials, all of examples, all of our libraries, all written in ES6. So it's definitely something worth spending some time learning. So that is my slides today. I would love to answer any questions that we have.
All right. I don't know. I hid my screen or my view. I don't know how to get me back.
Someone said, no generators in this talk. No, I didn't talk about generators, but yes, generators are very great. It's sort of like, the best way to describe a generator is like a pausable function, where if you have code that needs to be synchronous-ish, it's not actually synchronous, but you need it to like read like that. Generators is a great thing for that, as well as we have something coming called async await to the language, which is really, really going to help you. If you've ever done like crazy callback hell, or you've had lots and lots of promises, yes, I'm not sure when it's coming. Async await, it's in Chrome already. It's going to really make our life. Yeah, I'm not sure, but yeah, it's going to be really good.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of async and await. And it works on promises, so it's super easy to work with.
I've been doing a lot of, I'm working on a Node course right now, and my old, everybody used to use the library async, and then they'd use like async.waterfall or async. Like all those methods. And I've totally got rid of that, and I've converted the entire code base over to just using promises, which is, you can really step through everything. And then eventually what we're going to see is that you can write all of your routing and everything just in await, where you say await this data from the database, and then the line underneath it, you can just console log that value. There's no callback or then or anything like that.
Yeah, it's super clean. And I've actually found, so I used it on a Meteor app because Meteor has it polyfilled already, and they're using all the fiber stuff under the cover that they have.
Oh, awesome.
And, actually, a bird hit my window. That was weird. So yeah, like I put it in place, and I was sucking in values from an API, and I was actually going too fast. Like the Shopify API was like, whoa, you gotta slow down. And then like I was using it to bulk insert data into Mongo, and like Mongo was having trouble keeping up with all the calls. So I ended up having to put sleeps in to kind of deal with it, essentially, or set timeouts, I guess, essentially.
Oh, because you can await a set timeout that returns a promise.
Yeah.
Is that what you did?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's kind of nuts.
Cool.
But yeah, so yeah, let's get to some of these questions. So Ursan asked, while doing functional programming, you heavily use closures, but let and const defer to the use of closures, doesn't it?
Let and const defer to the, well, if you still have a function, that still is a block scope. So it's not that let and const aren't scoped to the function. It's just that they are also scoped to if statements and for loops, and anytime you have a block.
Okay. So anonymous viewer asked, for destructuring with nested objects, can you specify a particular parent object for excuse me, child properties with duplicate names?
No, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but can you specify a particular parent object for for child properties with duplicate. I'm not sure what that means. I don't think so.
Destructuring nested objects, yeah. Huh. George asked, how do you find mobile tablet support? I'm not sure what he's referring to. Maybe you can...
for ES6? Well, it's all about... Browser, right? Yeah, it's browser by browser. So the latest iOS 10 put in support for everything ES6, so it's good. What people are working on is performance. So sometimes you can use these fancy new things, but if you're really concerned about performance, sometimes they're a little bit slower. And what the people behind the browsers are doing now is making sure that you shouldn't have to like go back to the old harder ways to do it just because it's more performant. So they're making really big leaps and bounds. And I think in mobile tablet, that's going to be important as well.
Yeah. And Node 7 has pretty much like full ES6 support now too, right?
Yeah, that's the beauty of using ES6 is on the server is if you're not writing modules that are supporting like older versions of Node, but if you're just writing your own app that runs on Node 7, you don't need to worry about any of that browser support because it will just work in your environment, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Pretty slick. All right, so that's all the questions so far. Feel free to queue more up if you got them, guys. I did. Did you happen to see the other day? Someone like I wish I would have saved this down, but someone tweeted about I want to say like default arguments for a function and the fact that it's slower. Did you see that?
Default arguments for a function and it's slower. I didn't see that at all. No, I would imagine like if it's actually a problem for you, a lot of times people like to just sit around and talk about how something, if you run a function 10 million times, it's slower and it's not actually a problem for you. But if it is, then you're profiling and you're that deep nitty gritty into it, then yeah, you'll have to look into this sort of thing.
Yeah. That makes sense. All right. Let's see any other questions here.
Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I stopped my my screen sharing.
Oh, there we go.
Your mic is really duplicating. I'm not sure if everyone else can hear that.
My mic is duplicating.
Yeah, it's like grainy and also going over and over. You probably want to throw headphones on. I think that might be it.
Yeah. Okay.
Shitty robot. That's a good. Yeah.
Actually, like I've tried to hunt down this problem. I think it's my little M audio box.
Oh, that's frustrating.
Yeah, I need to get a new one.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you, Wes. Really appreciate you coming on and giving the talk.
You're welcome.
Excellent. I learned some things, so that was awesome too.
There you go.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. It was really fun. Say hi to me on Twitter.
Yes, definitely. Wes Boss on Twitter, and you also have wesboss.com if they want to see more about your stuff, right?
Yep.
This video has been a Space Dojo production. You can click the Learn More button to find out more about us at spacedojo.com. Or you can click the subscribe button to get notified about new videos we put out each week. Thanks for watching.